Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbity Bobbity Books. My name is Ellie and this is going to be my September reading wrap up. So firstly, I just want to point out that obviously I'm not at home at the moment. I'm actually in a caravan in Wales. We've come away for a little holiday, so I'm actually vlogging this week, so look out for that on my channel. I'm hoping to do quite a lot of reading because honestly the weather is awful. It's super rainy, super cold and miserable, but it's just nice to get away from everything and just have a little bit of peace and quiet. So we've been having such a lovely time. But yeah, whilst I'm here, I wanted to give a wrap up to keep things ticking over on my channel. So here we are, and yeah, I've got quite a few books to talk to you about today. I didn't have the best reading month in September, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So yeah, let's jump in with the first book. So the first book that I read in September was The Dark Between the Trees by Fiona Barnett. So this one is set in two timelines. We've got the past and the present. The past timeline is set in 1643 when a small group of soldiers seek cover in a nearby forest after being ambushed by enemies out on the field. And 17 men enter the forest and only 2 are ever seen again. And the stories that they tell of their time in the forest are very weird and very strange. And then we've got the present timeline when we follow a group of women who are going into the same forest for research, and they are trying to find out what actually happened to those soldiers all those years ago. And you're jumping between both of those two timelines, and there's a lot of folklore and myths surrounding that particular forest. The locals are afraid to go into it, and they talk of a scary creature that lives there and also witches that reside in the forest as well. So there's definitely folklore elements to the story within this one. So I feel like this book had a lot of potential. On paper it sounded like something that I would really enjoy, but it just didn't take for me. And I think my main issue with this story was the huge cast of characters, because there really were a lot of people within both timelines, and I just feel like there were too many characters for such a short page count, because we really didn't have enough time to get to know each and every character. And so for that reason I found it quite difficult differentiating between the characters, particularly in the beginning of this book, and so I found it a little bit confusing to get my head around in the beginning. I also feel like it was a little bit repetitive. The characters were going through the same kinds of things, they were walking around in circles, they were experiencing the same things, and it felt just a little bit repetitive. I did like the atmosphere. I do love a forest creepy setting, and I did like some of the descriptions in this story, and there were some creepy moments in here, but I do feel like it was building and building towards one particular horror element, and it felt like there should have been a big reveal at the end, and that just never happened, which felt quite disappointing. It felt like this story was going in one direction and then it took a left turn, and suddenly we had quite a strange ending, quite surreal, quite unresolved. And I normally quite like weird horror, and I didn't dislike the direction that this book took in the end, but I just feel like it was a little bit sudden and it wasn't very satisfactory because of that. I think just because the author had been putting in place all of these things to make us expect one thing, and then to just veer off at the last minute and leave a lot of questions unanswered felt quite unsatisfying to me. So yeah, this one just didn't quite hit for me. The next book that I read in September was House of Roots and Ruin by Erin A. Craig. So this is actually the sequel to House of Salt and Sorrows, which is a YA horror book that I read years ago and I remember really enjoying. So I was very excited to get back into this world and to read more from this author, but unfortunately this one fell a little bit flat for me, but we will get into that in a minute. What is this one actually about? So in this story we follow our main character, who is an 18-year-old girl. She's called Verity, I believe. Yeah, Verity. And her world kind of gets flipped upside down when she realises that she can see ghosts, and that's something that her family know she can do, but they've been kind of keeping it from her for her own protection, and they've been keeping her safe within their family estate because they're worried that if she goes out, other people might react strangely to her if she starts talking to ghosts and seeing ghosts and things like that. So yeah, she has this big shock when she finds out that she has this gift, and she's also just very frustrated frustrated, she feels very isolated, kind of overprotected by her big sister who's trying to sort of coddle her, I guess, and keep her within the estate. And so she decides to run away. She gets this invitation from this duchess of a place called Bloem, and the duchess is interested in Verity because Verity is an artist and she wants her to paint a portrait of her son Alexander. So Verity sneaks off in the night, she goes and gets a boat and she travels to this place called Bloem, and that's where the book takes place. And at first she is very enthralled by the place. It's a very beautiful place. There's lots of luscious plant life, crazy, you know, beautiful flowers. The duke of this place is actually a botanist and he spends all of his time curating these plants and making these special varieties of flowers and things like that, and it's very beautiful. And Verity is quite enamoured at first, but then it says on the back she becomes plagued with nightmares and the darker side of Bloem begins to show through its sickly sweet facade. So things aren't quite as rosy as they appear and that's when we start getting some of the creepiness coming through. So for me, I just feel like this book is far too long. It's pretty chunky for a YA horror. You know, it's over 500 pages, it's 530 something pages long, and a lot of the first half is just kind of description, scene setting, and it doesn't really feel like things are taking off for a very long time. So it just felt like a little bit of a drag. But my main issue with this book is our main character of Verity, because she is so stupid. It's actually really infuriating to read about her because she's presented with all of these clues and she just refuses to piece things together, and it takes her so long to realise what's going on. She practically has to be like hit over the head with evidence before she realises what's actually happening. So for that reason I just found her quite frustrating to read from. I understand that she had a very isolated upbringing and for that reason she is quite naive, but she just reads so childlike in this story. I also felt like the twists and turns were pretty obvious. There were clues right from page 3 basically as to what's going on, so you're just kind of waiting for those reveals to happen because it is, well, I felt like it was fairly obvious what was happening. There is also a romance in here which just felt a little bit odd. It didn't really gel or work for me, and it also had an ending which I think was supposed to be quite a shock, but yet again I feel like it was quite obvious, and it was one of those moments where I was just like, oh, how can the main character be so stupid? So for that reason I didn't really get on with this book. That being said, there were some lovely descriptions in here and it was a very creative setting, which I do appreciate. I like the fact that this place called Bloem revolves entirely around nature and plant life and things like that. The people use flowers as a form of communication, so if you get a bouquet of flowers, it's not just pretty, each flower will mean something. And you know, even the food that they eat, they'll incorporate different flowers for different meanings, and all of that was really creative and unique, so I do like it for that reason, and props to the author for creating such a, you know, interesting world. But yeah, I just didn't love the story or the main character. Next up we have Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reid. So this is a adult horror retelling of the Juniper Tree fairy tale, which is one of the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales. It's actually a story that I'm not familiar with, so I didn't really have any expectations going into this story. But yeah, this is a really interesting book. I'm not sure I can recommend it just because of how hard-hitting it is. I definitely want to say that right up front. This book deals with some really tough stuff. There's pretty much every trigger in here, you know, it really talks about a lot of disturbing content, so just please be warned before you go into this one. This follows our main character Marlinchan, who is a witch, and she is the youngest of 3 daughters. Their father is a wizard who's actually been cursed so that he can never feel satisfied. So, you know, every time he eats a meal he'll never feel full, he never feels happy with where he is in his life, he never feels, you know, content after a day's work. He never feels pleased with his daughters and how they're growing up. He just never feels satisfied, and because of that he's an incredibly angry man. He's very bitter, and he's also very abusive, and he keeps his daughters under lock and key and uses their sort of witch gifts to make money. So for example, our main character of Marlinchen has the gift of being able to tell people's ailments through touch. So he will send her clients and she will be able to detect what's wrong with them through physical touch. So, you know, they'll come to her with a headache and she'll be able to let them know what the reason for that is. So yeah, he kind of very much abuses his daughters, and they're very cut off from everybody else. And then one day Marlinchen and her sisters sneak out to go and watch a ballet one evening. So they sneak out at night, they go and they watch the ballet, and they meet the lead dancer, and then everything kind of starts to crumble down. Basically, they find out that the cost of freedom may be far more monstrous than they ever imagined, and it gets really intense. So like I said in the beginning, there are a lot of difficult topics that are discussed within this book. There are a lot of content warnings, there's on-page descriptions of things like sexual assault, eating disorders, and a lot of violence and gore, so please be careful going into this one. Our main character also experiences PTSD, and she has these really violent sort of intrusive thoughts, which are quite disturbing and jarring to read about in this book. So yeah, it's a very difficult one. I had to keep putting down this book and taking a break from it just because I found the subject matter to be so heavy. But I do respect that the author went there with this story and didn't shy away from the very real responses to trauma. I think a lot of people are surprised by how young the main character reads in this story, and I actually think that's on purpose because I think she is very naive and vulnerable in the beginning of this book. She is very passive and she doesn't really have a voice, and for me the main purpose of this story is watching her develop her own sense of identity following trauma. So she's kind of figuring out what she likes, what she wants from her life, and she's starting to gain autonomy. There's actually a quote in here that I found really sad where the main character says, "My eldest sister was right. I would smile blithely if someone tried to saw off my leg, but no one ever told me I was allowed to scream." And I feel like that really sums up our main character, that she spent most of her life just silently accepting her situation, or not even accepting it, but just kind of suffering in silence. And it's not until sort of partway through this novel that she realizes that she can scream, that she can cry, and that she can react. And it's just, honestly, it's such a harrowing story. But yeah, the writing is very beautiful and atmospheric in this book. It reads like a real classic fairy tale, so if you like that, you might enjoy this story. So I'll give you a little read of just like the second paragraph to give you a flavour of the writing style. So it says, "By evening the garden was lucent with the speckle of fireflies, rustling with the serration of wind through the willow branches, but otherwise quiet and still. From my bedroom I could see the whole brindled sweep of it, the stout swollen hedges, and the ivy that trawled over the rust-checkered gate. If anyone in Oblia walked down the road past our house, they might feel green tendrils curl around their ankles or hear the whisper of ferns through the fence." So yeah, it has that real kind of melodic, lyrical writing style that you often see in old-fashioned fairy tales, so I did like that quality to it. But yeah, I just found it a lot to handle, and it was really, really very dark, so please be warned if you're thinking about picking this one up. So following on from that, I wanted something a little bit lighter, so I decided to pick up Dunton Wood by William Hawthorne, because all I knew about this story was that it's a fantasy, a classic fantasy that involves moles as the main characters, and I thought that it was going to be a really charming, sort of light, fun, quaint read, and boy was I wrong. Turns out this one is actually incredibly violent and heartbreaking at times, and also deals with some really traumatic and heavy stuff that I just was not expecting at all. So this is a classic fantasy, and it's your traditional story of good versus bad, light versus dark, but it involves a cast of characters who are all moles. And yeah, there's lots of very luscious descriptions in here which did make it feel quite Tolkien-esque, but yeah, it did surprise me with some of the subject matter in here. So essentially in this book we follow a system of moles. So they all live in this series of tunnels in Dunton Wood, and at the beginning of the novel, or towards the beginning, the system is taken over by this evil mole. He is just a very nasty, horrible character. He had a traumatic start to life, which kind of explains how he's so evil, but essentially he's just a moustache twirling evil baddie, and he takes over the system, and he also stops a lot of the moles from engaging in religious practices, because the moles traditionally worship these big standing stones, but he stops them from going and performing these rites and these religious practices because he is basically just trying to control the moles. And following on from that, there is quite a lot of violence, there's war, and there's a lot of tension. And yeah, it gets pretty intense. We follow our main character, who is a mole called Bracken, and he has very much been interested in the old ways. He goes off and he explores this ancient system of tunnels that the moles have moved away from, and he discovers some sort of secrets there, and he feels very connected to these ancient stones. So he is, you know, he realizes the importance of these stones and worshipping them and kind of the old ways, really. We also have a character called Rebecca, who is full of life, and she has always had this real wonder about, you know, nature and just this thirst for life and this light within her, which is so lovely to read about. But then it's so heartbreaking when, you know, bad things happen to that character and she loses that spark. And yeah, you really do feel very invested in these characters quite quickly. I will say I haven't finished this book yet, so I don't have final thoughts. I'm actually about up to page 510, so I've read about 3/4 of this book, and unfortunately I found that the pacing has been a little bit off and it started to put me in a little bit of a slump. I really enjoyed the first part of this book. It started to drag for me, so I'm just going to put it down for a little bit and give myself a little bit of a break from it. But yeah, it's a very interesting one. I've been enjoying the audiobook for this one. The narrator is really fantastic at, you know, telling these gorgeous descriptions, and he brings the characters to life. I'll leave his name on the screen because I don't have it with me, but yeah, he does a fantastic job at immersing you in this world. I really enjoy listening to his narration, and yeah, there is a lot of description in here, I will say that. The author also obviously spent a very long time thinking about this mole system, these tunnels, what they look like, what different moles would be like depending on what section of the system they're from. It's very detailed, and some people might find that a little bit dense. I actually quite appreciate that. I feel like it's, you know, fantastic that the author spent so much time thinking about these things, and his love of nature really shines through his prose as well. He does sometimes get a little bit carried away talking about the trees and, you know, nature and things like that, but I actually quite enjoy that. But the pacing is a little bit hit and miss for me. So yeah, it's been really unexpected, quite harrowing at times, deals with some pretty tough stuff. So again, do check out content warnings before going into this one. Don't be fooled by the cutesy artwork on the front. But I will have my final thoughts for you in my October wrap up once I've actually finished the whole book. And then the final book that I read in September was Come Closer by Sarah Gran. This is a horror novella, and it's a possession story, and I did quite enjoy this one, although I do want to say that there is some unnecessary homophobic language in this book, which is a shame, and for that reason I can't recommend it as highly as I want to. But if we put that aside, then I do think this was quite a fun and entertaining read. We follow our main character, who is a woman in her 30s, I think, called Amanda, who becomes possessed by a demon, and it's basically documenting her experience of this. And it has that trope in it where the demon can't possess the person unless they let it in. So in the beginning, the demon is almost helping Amanda in some ways. They are sort of allowing her to say things that are truly on her mind and to do things that she actually secretly wants to do. For example, it sort of encourages her to voice her frustrations towards her husband when he comes home late from work without a good explanation. You know, it encourages her to take up smoking again, even though she quit that because her husband didn't like it and found it smelly and disgusting. And it encourages her to go out for that drink after work. So it all starts quite sort of subtly, and our main character isn't necessarily considering it to be a bad thing, but then things slowly build and build and it becomes more and more extreme until suddenly our character completely loses herself, completely loses control, and finds herself in some really terrifying and vulnerable situations. So yeah, this one was creepy, and there was some really like horrific scenes in here as well. So if you're looking for a quick read and you like possession type stories, then I think that you would enjoy this one. So yeah, that brings me to the end of this wrap up. Those were all of the books that I read in September. I had some interesting reads. I feel like there were a few sort of misses for me, but it's interesting to read those books and to kind of discover what my likes and dislikes are, because I feel like the more that I read, the more I'm getting to actually know my reading tastes. Yeah, I hope you are doing well, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. I hope that you are reading lots of fun books. It is now well into spooky season, so I hope you're really enjoying it. If you like that kind of thing, I hope you're reading lots of spooky horror books and things like that. Let me know in the comment section down below what you're reading, what you're enjoying, and just how you're doing, because I love to have a catch up with you in the comment section down below. And yeah, don't forget to like this video if you did like it, subscribe if you want to see some more from me, and I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!